Manor.
Did you know there's a way to get Manor's latest updates without searching for it? Now you can by subscribing to Manor Newsletter. With Manor Newsletter, you'll find out the latest developments on things such as feature release dates, the status of productions, exclusive discounts for subscribers, and much, much more. Be the first to know. A subscription is free and takes less than a minute to sign up. Visit manorhq.com and fill out the subscription form on the homepage. Don't get left alone in the dark. Sign up today for Manor Newsletter by visiting manorhq.com.
Follow Manor online and on social media. You can find Manor on Twitter at Official Manor, on Instagram at Manor Entertainment, on YouTube at Manor Entertainment, and on the official website address, manorhq.com. As always, share with others and spread the word.
Warning. The following program may contain violence, explicit language, sexual situations, and dark content, unsuitable for some listeners. It is intended for mature audiences only. Discretion is advised.
She was caught as soon as she ran out into the road. The cadaverous shape in overalls turned, and she stopped to catch her breath, hands on her knees. She fancied she could hear every single tendon in his neck scrape like dry leather until he fixed his bug eyes on her.
"What do you want?"
she said, panting. Even in the dark of night, she could make out his deformity. His nose was almost completely dissolved from decades of snorting methamphetamines, and she shivered despite her bold talk. In the hollow, teenage moms used his skull-like visage to frighten their kids in the line, until those kids were old enough to fear real things. He flapped his gums at her in slow motion, and she straightened up to face him.
"What's that? You want me to go as you for Halloween?"
she said. He thumped his walking stick on the ground and managed to wheeze, along with his flapping this time.
"Old man, looking for you."
"Yeah?"
she said, and anger flooded through her.
"Well, you tell him soon enough, I'll be looking for him, too."
She deftly kicked the walking stick, and the skeleton man stumbled to one knee. He moaned.
"I'm looking for him, too!"
she screamed into his face, then darted across the road. There was a dead man in the woods, and the fact that she expected to see him soon pebbled her skin with goosebumps.
"Peckerwood,"
she said when she blundered into a thorn bush. A bead of dark blood blossomed on her fingertip. She fancied that the black thorn gleamed wetly in the moonlight after tasting her, but she knew that was her imagination. Magination was how she heard her neighbors pronounce it, and that she was given to flights of fancy. She was told so often enough.
"Peckerwood,"
she said again, a favorite curse, as it reminded her of her cousins. She squeezed the digit and watered the thorn bush with a few precious drops of blood, looking to buy a little friendship in the dark woods. Normally she was called Hey Girl or Little Bitch. Never Roberta Jean, her Christian name, And she would sometimes answer to RJ, but she really thought of herself as the Hoodoo Girl. A dry branch snapped underfoot, and she froze like a deer about to get both barrels. But nothing spoke up, except the late-season crickets. She moved on after a moment, biting back a yelp when a branch switched her thigh, bared by the cut-off shorts favored by her kind. At near to midnight, the reality of her daytime fears was no match for the imaginary terrors lurking in the dark. She moved through the woods mostly by feel, grateful for the bit of moonlight dribbling down through the tangled branches overhead. A scream froze her, and she pressed her back to a tree, but she couldn't see a thing.
A screech owl, you idiot!
She scolded herself.
A little bitty bird you could fry up in grease and eat for supper.
She heard it again off to her right as she slid around the tree. She was just releasing a pent-up breath when fingers plucked at her hair. She jumped away and twisted, catching her heel on a root. Her butt hit the ground, and her teeth clacked together hard enough to make her eyes water. She scooted backwards and hurriedly armed the wet from her eyes so she could see clearly. But there was nothing but a thin-fingered branch swaying from her movement. She heard something slither through dead leaves, and she turned on her seat, looking about wildly. At night, everything seemed to blur and move if you looked at it hard enough, and her eyes began to tear up again.
What if it's him?
The thought came unbidden. How would a dead man move through the woods? Would it drag itself on its belly, leaving a wide trail through the leaves as it crawled blindly towards the human warmth it no longer possessed?
It's only a night snake looking for mice.
Hoodoo Girl inhaled and made a thick, snotty sound in her nose, the sound a kid makes just before a loud fit of blubbering. She shivered and hugged her knees to her chest, and every ounce of her exposed girl skin rose in bumps as her eyes watered freely. She looked up at the thin bits of moon she could see through the branches, all knotted like an old man's fingers, and the glowy shape doubled and tripled with prisms. She did blubber then, great sucking sounds full of snot and fear and giving up. Her chest bucked, and it hurt her to hold herself in such a position. She was a little girl, alone in the nightly woods, with a dead man.
Hey, girl.
A dead man crawling for her because she was warm. Even shivering, she was warmer than a man whose soul has left his flesh to go hard and stiff.
Little bitch.
A dead man coming for her in the night, getting closer. And in the day, the old man would be coming for her.
Fuck you!
She recoiled from the violent scream and didn't realize it was her own voice until she had leapt unsteadily to her feet, a rope of mucus swinging from her nose.
Fuck you!
She screamed again and spun around, her head light and swimmy from the sudden rise. She had no idea how many times she had spun in place until she stopped, hunched over and panting, eyes slowly focusing on the giant string bobbling down from her face. She scooped it off and wiped the snot onto dead leaves.
Fuck you,
she whispered, out of breath, coming to her senses. There were worse things than dead men in the woods. It took a minute, but the crickets came back with their fearless chorus, and the Hoodoo Girl figured she had maybe not killed herself with foolishness yet. She pressed her palm flat against the knobby bark of a tree, moving slowly forward and keeping the moon where it needed to be overhead so she could find her way. The old man and his messages. Funny that even in cruelty there was opportunity, if you were sharp enough to grab it in both hands and make it cry uncle. Hoodoo Girl began to move a little more surely through the woods, her fear reduced to the murmur of a TV in another room. She thought about the fancy lady a few days back who had stopped her car rather than run Hoodoo Girl down. The fancy lady who saw everything about her in an instant. and they had a whole talk without almost any words. Hoodoo Girl had stepped out of the way of the shiny car that even dirt was too polite to stick to, and the fancy lady put the machine in gear. Something broke in Hoodoo Girl's heart as the car went past like hope washing over a fall, and then stopped some 20 feet down the road, the driver's window whirring down with an electric hum. Hoodoo Girl had run after the car and skidded to a stop by the driver's window as the fancy lady took off her sunglasses and looked up at the gawky preteen hillbillyette. The only words they actually exchanged out loud came from the fancy lady in her expensive car, and each one seemed to be a sentence all to itself.
Only if you let it happen.
The fancy lady drove each individual word home like a hammer pounding nails into a board. Hoodoo Girl saw her own reflection staring back at her in stereo when the fancy lady put her sunglasses back on. Then the car took off down the dirt road and kicked rocks into her bare shins. Hoodoo Girl forced her mind back from the memory. It offered her no protection, even if she did like to roll around in it like it was a magical pool.
Only if you let it happen.
Well, she was about to make something else happen if she could keep her full head focused. Carefully, she picked her way through another blackthorn patch. Her path was carefully reasoned out as the least likely to be followed by anyone else on account of its sheer unpleasantness. There was an easier way into the clearing, but she didn't dare risk it. And then she was there, and her first thought was,
Isn't moonlight supposed to be silver?
the legendary clearing was lit a sickly gray, and she felt spiders crawl down her spine as she looked upon the spot where the old man conducted his sternest business. Scattered stumps rose out of the sparse grass, slimy with the fungoid bulges of toadstools that all but hissed the warning, "These stumps are not for sitting." Not that this was a clearing for resting in, anyway. It was a clearing for dying. The hanging tree was bent over like a giant finger sticking up out of the earth. Its branches had been crudely sawn off, and its twisted roots hunched up out of the ground, eager to trip anyone who approached. A thick rope, frayed with age, was wrapped in coils around its crooked tip, and a noose dangled down, swaying despite the lack of wind. Hoodoo Girl stepped into the clearing and immediately felt her skin go greasy in the deadlight. She stumbled once and caught herself on a stump. Something squished beneath her hand, and she grunted in revulsion.
Where was the dead man?
She had heard the talk. She knew the old man was sending a message. She knew what that meant.
Where was the body?
She stood under the hanging tree and stared straight up at the noose above her. The place sapped her will, and she felt the truth of how stupid her plan was. How unworkable. She needed the hanging man to make her hex, and there was no hanging man. She closed her eyes and began to whisper a chant. Chants had power. Anyone with the hoodoo knew that. But this wasn't that type of chant.
Only if you let it happen. Only if you let it happen. Only if you let it happen.
She saw herself reflected in the fancy lady's sunglasses and thought about how such a situation would never befall a lady who could waltz in and out of the old man's grip without a by your leave.
Only if you let it happen.
Nothing would dare even get on the fancy lady's car, let alone bar the path of the lady herself. Hoodoo Girl imagined what would happen if something tried to stop the lady. Why, the lady would not let it.
Only if you let it happen.
Hoodoo Girl opened her eyes and looked away from the empty noose. Instead, she studied the ground and began separating her footprints from the other fresh marks in the dirt. The oily dirt of the clearing was perfect for tracks, and she quickly found 2 sets of boot prints moving away from the hanging tree, side by side, with a draggy patch made in the middle. Chewing her bottom lip, she moved alongside the tracks. She didn't know how to tell a squirrel print from a gopher's, but she wasn't stupid. When she came across the first half-crushed can, she picked it up and sniffed it. A little bit of liquid inside smelled like beer, so she upended the can and drank the warm liquid. A little ways on, she saw a cigarette butt that didn't have that washed-out gray look a butt gets when it's been rained on. There were 2 more crushed cans near the edge of the woods that held the piss-fresh smell of cheap beer, but no liquid for her to sip. A trail led into the woods with harder earth that didn't hang on to footprints so well. Roots grew all across it, and branches hung low, so that it managed to be uninviting and beckoning at the same time. The rational part of her mind said she was hesitating, because there might be a couple of the old man's fellas still on the trail. Fellas she did not want to meet. It was said that during the lean years, the old man would call in some of the boys if they were of the right age, and these turned into the meanest of her cousins. But the kid part of her was watching the branches move and wondering if the windy whisper of wood on wood was saying,
Come on in, little bitch.
She felt the blubbering coming back.
Only if you let it happen.
She stepped hurriedly onto the trail, scuttling over roots and beneath branches. She would not let herself turn back for all the money in the world. The beer cans appeared at uneven intervals, and she tested each one for smell and for sips, but the men continued to be thorough in their consumption of the liquid. Hoodoo Girl saw an opening up ahead in what might have been a shack, and she felt a strange elation. The building was tilting from disrepair and looked like an old wooden still of the illegal kind, fallen into disuse after her people discovered the joys of cooking crystal instead of shine. There was another can just inside the clearing, and by this point, snatching it up to check for perfume and elixir was automatic. It wasn't until she was several steps into the clearing that Hoodoo Girl realized something. The can was still cold to the touch. Hoodoo Girl froze and realized she could see a road, no more than tire tracks, leading through the woods beyond the shack. There was a mound of empty beer cans near the shack's door. She stood there, listening, almost a caricature of stillness, but couldn't hear anything except the normal night noises. Even so, if not for the fancy lady, she would have turned, telling herself there was another way to avoid the old man, but knowing in her heart she was really submitting to the inevitable. Hoodoo Girl felt strangely outside of her body as she crept forward until she could touch the piled cans and feel their coldness. Her breath came in little sips as she peered around the edge of the shack and saw the rear bumper of a pickup. And even in her lightheaded state, in that nameless place beyond fear, she would have slunk away into the woods, except she heard a peculiar sound. With the exaggerated steps of a child playing hide-and-seek, she crept around the building, hands running along the wooden plank walls, not even noticing the splinter that stuck in her palm. Peering around the corner, she studied the rear bumper and saw it was a truck she was familiar with. 2 sets of boots were sticking out from the truck bed, toes up. And there was the sound, more clearly now. Snoring. 2 snores, in fact. One from someone quiet, one from someone who sounded like a broken outboard engine. She knelt at the corner, frozen, until there was a sharp metallic slap, and she jerked in surprise. One of the fellas had let loose a mighty wind that ricocheted off the truck bed like a fart barked off the wooden seats at school. Hoodoo Girl pulled herself back around the corner and covered her mouth with her hands. Hysterical laughter, 1,000 times worse than blubbering, just tearing to get out. The next blast was long and ripping, and she wondered if he had tilted in his stupor. She crawled around to the other side of the cabin, gasping with the effort not to laugh, and saw the pile of beer cans. She grabbed one, and the crippled fortune that watched over a place like her home showed its toothless smile. The can was at least half full. She downed it in one long swallow and stifled a prodigious belch, one that would have been at least as loud as the farts. That nearly set her off again, but fortune offered its gummy grin a second time and blessed her as it could, with the natural effect half a can of shotgun beer has on a 12-year-old who hasn't yet become an alcoholic. It calmed her. She stood, swaying from the beer and near hyperventilating, and leaned against the building. Then she rolled around on her right shoulder until she was facing the shack, more importantly, the door. She listened and even sniffed at the door, but all she could smell was the pile of empties. She pulled it open by its rusty handle and stared into blackness. A waft of cool, fetid air rushed out at her, as if this were a door not often opened. It smelled like a root cellar where a couple of canning jars had cracked and gone bad. The first step creaked loudly under her weight, so she hurriedly slipped inside. The door banged shut behind her and plunged her into absolute darkness. She fumbled blindly at the small satchel tied to her belt and pulled out a fat candle and a book of matches, meeting the wick with a shaky match on a third try. The flame clung reluctantly, small at first, and she held her breath.
"Burn, damn you!"
she whispered, just to hear a friendly voice. Holding the candle before her, she carefully made her way down the creaking staircase, cobwebs on the walls swaying in the wake of her passage. Finally, she stepped onto a floor of hard-packed dirt covered in a kind of slippery mold, and her small sphere of light revealed earthen walls on either side, stretching away into the dark. Roots hung from the walls like stringy hair, and her skittering imagination wondered if there were people buried in the walls, and it was hair.
"Stupid girl,"
she whispered. She could dimly make out the circular rise of an old stone well deeper in the room, and walked toward it, promising herself she would scrap this whole deal if the body was down inside. Dangling webs caressed her face, and she flinched away from imagined spiders. Her light gave the well definition and revealed crudely placed stones that made a round wall as high as her waist. The mold covered it like knobby green skin, and she wondered at the foulness of whatever scummy liquid must be down at the bottom. Slowly, carefully, holding her candle high, she leaned forward over the well and was looking down inside when she noticed the feet of the man standing in the corner. Her throat locked up and turned a scream into a squeak, which saved her life as just then she heard the unmistakable sound of voices coming from up above. Hoodoo Girl slapped her free hand onto the candle flame and burned herself with hot wax. As she dropped down, pressing her back to the wall, she did her best to be silent, to not even breathe, as she moved in an awkward squat walk to what she hoped was the side away from the stairs. Time is not a constant, and anyone who says so is a liar. Hoodoo Girl lived days in those next few seconds, as her eyes bulged and her pupils went completely black to drink in the non-light. She was equally fearful that there would come a sudden brightness from above, or a hand reaching over the lip of the well to pull her up by the hair, kicking and screaming. After 5 seconds, she would have welcomed any succor and fleetingly wished she had found the corpse so she could find comfort in holding the dead man's hand. If Hoodoo Girl had later been able to see a video of her facial expressions at some future date, she would not have recognized any of them. Not the jaw-dropped horror, or hyperventilating hysteria, and especially not the one she wore as she crouched down there in the black. Her eyes bulged, and terror flexed her jaw down and thrust it out, pulling her skin taut and turning her cheekbones into sharp points. There was an almost impossible inch of pink gums exposed above her white teeth as her lips drew back. Somewhere during that interminable period, Hoodoo Girl had transcended her emotional range. There comes a point where the brain can no longer process the excretions of the adrenal glands, and the mind becomes so numb to terror that it becomes fey. What she felt wasn't courage, nor was it a lack of fear. She had descended to the sublime state of a rat trapped by much larger animals. When she heard the muffled engine kick over up above, she automatically fished out another match and lit the candle. She held it over her head as she stood and turned to face the man in the corner. She could see more of the man now, and he was strange in shape and unmoving. Edging closer revealed him to be a man covered in a sheet, like a child playing ghost, but there were no holes cut in the sheet for his eyes. Her feet slid like whispers across the dirt as she stepped in, and she didn't flinch when a dangling cobweb caught fire and burned in a split second of bright light. Neither did he. Still, she was 12, and before anything else, she poked him rudely through the sheet.
"You better be dead, you peckerwood bastard."
When he didn't answer, she bunched the fabric in her free hand and carefully stepped back to draw it off of him. His face was purple, but muted, not garish like her stepmom's makeup. His eyes bulged and had already gone the milky white of a dead trout. But it was his tongue that brought tears to her eyes. It bulged like a fat mushroom from his mouth, impossibly big, and colored the flat gray of stone. She couldn't imagine the pain that would make a person stick their tongue out like that. She began to cry quietly, an adult sound unlike her previous outburst.
"I'm sorry."
She wasn't aware of her own whisper. She tugged the rest of the sheet off and threw it aside where it fluttered to the ground. He remained standing against the wall, rigid with rigor mortis. She fished a hatchet from her satchel and took his forearm in her free hand. It was stiff and possessed no apparent temperature, feeling already as if somehow she and the dead man were on the same side. Hoodoo Girl gave him a reassuring squeeze and then lifted her hatchet.
"The hand of a criminal."
She buried the hatchet into his wrist, and it was like cutting wood filled with dirt. She struck again and said,
"The hand of a criminal."
His whole body shifted with the impact, but he did not fall. On her third swing, her hatchet dug into the dirt wall, and the severed hand thudded to the floor. The next part was more delicate, and her nose wrinkled at the smell when she tugged his shirt out of his belt. Surely he had shit himself when he died, but she couldn't hold that against him. She slipped the folding knife out of her pocket and took one stiff fold of his belly fat in her hand, then carefully filleted a small section. She thought of catfish, and her belly rumbled. Hoodoo Girl left one end attached and was able to peel it free, almost swinging it out like some weird door of meat so that it stuck straight out of his belly. She was fortunate that he was a fat man, but what really helped her was that in the drying of his flesh, she could see the different layers almost as clearly as rock strata. Hoodoo Girl scooped up her candle and held it carefully under the part she wanted. She knew she'd probably get a little of the other stuff, but figured skin would likely burn off, and blood was always good for hexing.
"Fat of a gibbeted man,"
she said. It took longer than she had planned, but eventually she saw a bubble and a yellowy bit dripped off. She positioned her candle better, and the next bubble of fat landed in the hot wax next to the wick. The drippings hissed and sputtered in the flame, but it was a thick storm candle, and it didn't go out. When she had what she thought was enough, she knelt and carved a divot in the palm of the severed hand and wedged the candle into it. The fingers curled inward around it like stiff claws, as if to keep the candle in place. Hoodoo Girl drew symbols and letters in the dirt around the hand where it held the candle, the most important being her true name. When she was ready, she held her own palm over the flame and whimpered as she was burned, but she managed to say each verse 3 times before removing her hand from the fire. The first was,
The hand of a criminal.
the second was,
The fat of a gibbeted man.
and the third verse was her true name.
Hoodoo Girl. Hoodoo Girl. Hoodoo Girl!
She cried as agony forced her to jerk her hand away, and she fell back, clutching it, shuddering. But her pain was matched by the knowledge of what she had done. She had made a hex. The most powerful hex of all. And whether it was the hand of glory itself, or the night she had spent making it, she already felt transformed.
I will not let it happen.
Carefully, she replaced the sheet over the one-handed corpse and carried her treasure up the stairs, using the flickering light from her hex to show her the way. She had to get home quickly and unseen, and desperately needed a few hours' sleep. Tomorrow would be a busy day. You've been listening to Manor House, Episode 11, Hand of Glory. This episode was originally recorded and produced in 2015. Subscribe to this show and leave a rating, a review, and general feedback wherever you're receiving this program. Share with others on social media and at home. Your feedback, as well as sharing with others, helps grow and continue future productions. Credits. Story by John C. Foster. Script by Rock Capuano. Performed by Rock Capuano. Music and sound design provided by Edo SFX. Manor House theme song by Alan Postscript. Theme song based on The Shining by The Angelas. Cover art by Luke Spooner. Manor House was created by Rock Capuano. Manor House is a Manor Entertainment production. The story, all names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this production are fictitious. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, and products is intended or should be inferred. This production is property of Manor Entertainment, LLC. No portion of this production may be reproduced or used by any means without the proper written consent of Manor Entertainment, LLC. This production is protected under the copyright laws of the United States and other countries throughout the world. Country of first publication, United States of America. Any unauthorized exhibition, distribution, or copying of this production, or any part thereof, may result in civil liability and criminal prosecution. Copyright 2019, Manor Entertainment, LLC.
Manor.